Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. Summer is here and it's really hot outside. I don't know about you, but it's got me wishing for the cooler weather of fall. Last year I painted a Kurnoth Hunter in a fall color scheme, and I'd like to revisit those colors on a Branchwych, so let's grab our brushes and get started. I primed the model with my favorite method, beginning with a light gray undercoat all over, followed by a heavy spray of white from the top and sides. Alternatively, you could prime your model solid white or an off-white color and get great results too. I began by base coating the model with Skeleton Horde. Contrast paint works great in layers, and this layer will provide a nice foundation to build upon. When applying contrast paint, work on one section at a time and apply plenty of paint to ensure it flows into all the recesses. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint as needed. I worked my way around the model, one section at a time, and painted the body and weapon handle. I did my best to avoid painting the hair or the little creature on her shoulder. I want to start adding some color to the model with Nazdreg yellow, and I painted it on the ends of the branches and the bark loincloth. It's really easy to blend out the edge. Just paint one section at a time, rinse the brush, and then use the clean brush to blend the wet paint. Next I painted a layer of Martian orange from Vallejo Xpress color on the base of the branches and on the bottom of the bark loincloth. I blended out the paint in the same way as the yellow layer. I don't necessarily blend every section, I blend only where it needs it. As the paint settles and pools on the model's surface, that's when I'll make a decision on whether or not to blend. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. Then I shaded the orange areas with Fyreslayer flesh. Just like the last two layers, I blended any areas that needed it. We'll leave the yellow and orange areas for now, and move on to painting the bark. I mixed a small amount of contrast medium into some Wyldwood, about 1 part medium to 3 parts Wyldwood, and I painted it all over the bark and skin. After the first layer dried, I added a little bit more contrast medium and painted a glaze on any areas that looked uneven. Think of a glaze like a layer of transparent glass. We want to tint the layers that are underneath, not cover them up completely. Look for any sections where the first layer didn't get quite dark enough, and with barely any paint on the brush, run the brush over the area that needs it. There shouldn't be much paint going on the model at all, and it should dry pretty quickly. You can apply as many layers as you want and build up the color until it looks right to you. I plan on highlighting the skin later, so I don't want to darken it too much. I'd like to distinguish the weapon from the skin, so I painted that with a layer of black Templar, and I made sure to blend out the edge into the orange. I think a deep red color would look nice for the hair, so I base coated it with Blood Angel's red. Then I shaded the hair with Fyreslayer flesh. I think green would be a good color for this worm, and I started it off with a layer of croak green. Even though croak green is labeled as a shade paint, it's still great for base coats, and you can apply it just like any other contrast paint. The light color will also serve as a great foundation for the next layers, just like the skeleton horde layer in the first step. I want the scales to be a real dark green, and I really like the color I mixed up for a Tyranid video, which is 2 parts Black Templar and 1 part Aeldari Emerald. You can check out the video here if you haven't seen it yet. Then I painted all the claws with Black Templar. When the first coat dried, I painted a second to deepen the color. I also painted the strings at the end of the braid, but I only gave those 1 coat. Moving on to the weapon, I base coated the blade with Bonewhite, and I painted a second layer afterwards for an even finish. I also painted the item at the end of the braid. I'm not sure if it's a bead or some piece of jewelry. Either way, I think painting it the same color as the weapon will help balance the color on the model. I want to give the Bonewhite areas a green tone, so I diluted some Mantis Warriors green with about 4 parts contrast medium, and I painted a thin layer all over. I don't want this layer to pool or create too much shading. I'll add some deeper shadows next. Next I used some undiluted Mantis Warriors green and built up some shadows on the blade, similar to how I would shade a metallic surface. Mantis Warriors green doesn't blend very well at all, so I would recommend building up the color in thin layers, 1 by 1, rather than trying to put down a lot of paint at once and blend to the edge. I'd like to paint a green glowing effect on the eyes and the runes, and I'm starting off with a soft glaze of Moot green, thinned with water. With barely any paint on the brush, paint a thin glaze wherever you want the glowing effect. The brush should have almost no paint on it, basically just damp, and the paint should dry almost immediately after it leaves the brush. Build up a couple layers around the runes until it looks right to you. With the softer glaze done, now I'm moving on to a really sharp brush and some undiluted paint, and I painted green directly into each crevice. You may want to paint a second layer after the first one dries to build up the color. And finally I painted a few accents with toxic yellow. This is the most fun part, but it can be easy to overdo it. I think it's better to paint just a couple dots near the center of each section. At this stage you could base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to keep going and add some highlights. I highlighted the edges of the bark with Steel Legion Drab. Some areas will need more or less highlighting, depending on how the base coat layers dried. On some of the smoother areas I added a few wood grain looking lines. I'm also trying to avoid highlighting near the glowing effects. I find that the glowing effect looks more convincing if the surrounding areas are darker. I mixed some Bonewhite into the Steel Legion Drab, about equal parts, and I highlighted some of the raised edges. and then I picked out some of the most prominent edges and corners with Bonewhite. While I had the Bonewhite on my palette, I painted all the edges on the weapon blade as well. I thinned white with some water and painted the very edges and corners of the blade, and I also highlighted the light sections on the worm. Let's move on to highlighting the warm fall colors, starting with the red hair. I picked out the top edges of the braid with Wild Rider red. Next I highlighted a few areas with Jokaero orange, beginning with a few edges on the braid. I want the hair to look red rather than orange, so I'm trying to keep these highlights to a minimum. Then I highlighted the other orange areas on the model. I want to continue the gradation effect, so I painted the orange highlights starting at the bottom of the loincloth. There will be a point where the highlight color matches the color beneath it, and that's where I'll stop. Moving on to Averland Sunset, I continued the highlights up on the yellow sections. I let the highlight overlap the orange area a little bit too. And then I painted a few final highlights with Toxic Yellow. I tried to keep these reserved for the leaves and the very ends of the branches. Toxic Yellow is really bright, and I think a little goes a long way, so I want to keep the brush strokes as small and as narrow as possible. The weapon handle has a burnt kind of look, which I'd really like to keep, so I'll paint a subtle highlight with a warm gray. Stormvermin fur worked out well. The last thing to finish is the worm. I'd like the claws to have a glossy looking effect, almost like obsidian. I painted a sharp edge highlight with Dawnstone. I tried to keep the lines as thin and as narrow as possible. Then I made a few extreme highlights with white paint. I thinned the paint with water and have barely any on my brush. I'm just picking out some of the corners and making a few tiny dots for reflections. I don't want to add too much. A little will go a long way here. Next I highlighted the scales with Sybarite green, focusing mostly on the edges. I added a few extra lines here and there, similar to how I paint Tyranid scales. And finally I mixed some white into the Sybarite green and picked out a few of the edges and corners. I used an old brush to apply textured paste to the base, and then sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the textured paste dried, I painted the entire base with thinned Rhinox hide. Then I dry brushed the base with Mournfang brown, followed by Balor brown, and then a light dry brush of Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with black, and after that dried, I applied some patches of static grass and fall-colored foliage with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. Well, this was a refreshing change of pace. It was nice painting something a little different like the weapon blade. It's got me wanting to paint some more Sylvaneth, especially some of those giant bugs. Would you like to see more Sylvaneth models on the channel, or maybe something else? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.